So I'm a sophomore. I know kind of what I want to do. But I've narrowed it down a little bit, as you said. I've thought about what classes I'm good at, what I'm interested in. There are, I want to say, thousands of colleges in the U.S. So we're going to also start kind of in the U.S. We'll talk about Europe and Canada and other places later, but there are so many colleges. How do I start? And is U.S. news rankings the best place? Because I think a lot of students will gravitate there.
Do a little bit of research, but don't
What
be
goes
so.
into that research? What goes into that research?
I think location is really important. I think the school experience is very important, right? You're going to have to want to live in an area that you want to live in. Schools are very different from each other, obviously, right? Living in LA and maybe living in the East Coast, right? It's going to be a totally different experience altogether. I always tell students, before thinking about a college list per se, just focus on the now, right? Because there will always be options, right? And then, it's always good to have your preferences, I suppose, in terms of location, in terms of maybe even the university kind of curriculum style, right? And how they teach. To give an example, a school like Hopkins is very famous for being very traditional in the way they deliver a course, right? Now, for some people, that's great, right? Having this kind of rigid, very traditional system of education. Others might want to enjoy kind of the social life, right? And the social element of colleges. But I think that's a decision that generally students end up making once they make their college list and they start, making choices between two schools that might be very similar. But at first, I don't think students should be focused so much on the rankings per se, right? That's eventually going to come in the end of junior year and maybe even into senior year.
Well,
I'm just going to have a quick question because that's not something that's like on an Excel spreadsheet that you can download about schools. Like I think that one of the reasons that we talk about U.S. news rankings is it's such an easy source to read through, right? Like if you click number one schools for business, number one schools for English literature, like it's very easy to navigate that information versus what you're saying is something that's a little more nuanced. So how can students get to that information?
I mean, social media is a great place to start, right? YouTube is a great place to start. There are a lot of people willing to share their experience about certain colleges, right? Of course, you can start with a place like US News, just kind of narrow everything down to 20, 30 schools, right, that you might be interested in. But I think it's up to the student, right, in 10th grade to look around, right? Everybody, like, I suppose, I don't know, I haven't watched a YouTube review very recently, but most people, some will talk about the good of the school, some will talk about the bad, right? And if you feel like you can handle that, right, it might be a good candidate, right, for a school later on. In terms of other sources, it's mostly videos, right? Sometimes the book, sometimes like the Fisk list of colleges, right, college rankings or U.S. News, they just simply don't give the nuanced kind of details, right?
You can't do a vibe check.
Yeah, you can do a vibe check. You can tell from the student that actually just shows up on YouTube, the way they smile, right? If they look like they've been stressed for the last 3 years, maybe what kind of school, right, that you're getting into.
Maybe on the more practical side, then, I think this is the big thing people think about when it comes to college admissions, and it's the numbers. It's your academics. It's your standardized test scores. How should those play a part in deciding where you might want to go to college? Or should it be the other way around? You should decide where you want to go and then try to raise your numbers or fit your numbers to go there. Chicken egg question.
I'm more of the think about what you can control now and let the college list you make your decisions about college lists later. I've seen people, they'll tell me, oh, their dream school is, so and so, right, in sophomore year. And they get so stressed. I guess it's a little bit of tunnel visioning, right? And not reaching particular numbers and benchmarks for a particular school, students end up, they feel down, right, by sophomore year. Maybe they didn't do well one semester. Maybe they got a B or C in a course. And what happens is that if you're tunnel visioning like that, you're never going to like explore other interests that you might have, right? You've been educated in such a, like, I suppose, a very linear, very rigid way, right? That there's a lot of missed opportunity, right? Over it, that can be over 2 semesters, that can be over 2 years, right? And there are a lot of students who regret that, right, at the beginning of their senior year. Now, of course, later on, right, once you become, I think, your second semester of junior year, the numbers are going to matter, right? I think by your junior year, you're going to have a general idea of what's possible. Sophomores, I'm not entirely sure, right? Because maybe you might take one AP course, maybe two, no IB courses at that point, right? So how can you make that determination of where you're going to be going or not, right? That young.
So your AP courses are kind of a good indicator of where you are academically?
Of course, it has rigor, right? That's colleges are going to look at your AP grades, right? At, how you do in school. It helps having a good AP score, right? Going into college, it validates whatever you did in school.
You think class rank also factors into that?
Class ranks certainly play a role, right? There are percentiles, right? In school, there are statistics. What was the general rule? With students, we have, at particular schools, we say that, hey, the top 10% of a school have the right to apply to a certain level of school, right? Students who are somewhat struggling with their GPA and, maybe call out a school in the top 10, I might actually have to tell them that this is going to be a very difficult task, right? You're trying to get in to a particular school with intangible qualities that you hope, right, the admissions officers see, But if you're kind of banking on that, right, I wouldn't. There's so many applicants to these upper end schools, right? That I think numbers is kind of the best way to kind of show that you're doing well.
I just want to maybe dive into that a little more because it seems no-brainer to think that students who are at the top of their class rank know that they're at the top of their class rank. Like that isn't news. Nobody's got to sit them down and be like, you're a good student. They know. So those students, have certain aspirations and have a certain idea of what kind of schools they can apply to or can reliably get into. Students at the lower end of the rank or like lower end of the group also have a pretty, I'm guessing, have a good idea of where they probably is not realistic for them to apply to. But most of the students that we see are students who are not bad students. They're all definitely above average students, and they're not looking to go to like top 10 schools, right? They're looking to go to schools between like top 20, top 40, top 50 schools. But there's a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety about, I have these numbers. I can Google medians of different schools for different majors on the internet, but I'm not sure what that is supposed to tell me about, does this qualify, like, can I apply here? If we're really talking about seniors and juniors right now, we're not talking about freshmen and sophomores who have like a lot of time to improve their scores. If you're set in a certain score range for your standardized testing and your GPA, and you're trying to figure out like what your list can look like, what kind of schools you kind of can allow yourself to write to, there's going to be I see a lot of confusion about that. We see that on a kind of daily basis.
Yeah.
So, some students are lucky to have an adult, like a counselor or maybe school teachers or, someone else to sit down and walk them through that. But if a student is kind of having to rely on the internet to do that on their own, how are they able to look at their numbers, compare it with the numbers of a university, and kind of, get a feel for this is a reach for me, but I can try. This is something that's like maybe I can throw something at it, but probably not likely to happen. This is something that my numbers definitely more comfortable match with.
Chance me.
Right, exactly, essentially. How can I do that for myself?
I think you have to make adjustments to how many reach, target, and safety schools you're going to
So let's
apply
talk
to.
about that. Reach, target, safety. What are those?
A reach school, it's defined very differently, right? Just the other day, I had a conversation with a student regarding this, and their definition of what a target or safety school is very different from the way I see a target and safety, right? If you think a safety school is something where you have maybe an over 50% chance to get into, right? Then you might want like two of those. So places that you're willing to go to, right? Because there's so many schools out there. There are great schools out there that have higher acceptance rates, right? You may want to do two safeties and then maybe just kind of increase the number of reaches that you have, which might be anything that's under 15%, right? But making adjustments to the list might be one way to compensate for that if there's any type of confusion. So if you feel like if you lack the confidence of going into a particular school, right, then make sure you have enough target schools, in anything in the 20-30% range, right? Then again, schools that you're willing to go to. If you really want to risk it, if you really want to chance it, then make sure you have enough safeties, right? If things don't go well. But I always tell students to kind of define, at least determine how many schools they want to apply to in every category, right?
But where's that 20%, 30% number coming from? Is that like the acceptance rate of a school? Like how are students supposed to get a feel for that?
There are a couple of resources for that. One way is, of course, using sources like the U.S. News, right? They're generally accurate about that. Another thing is something called the common data set, right? That many schools actually publish. It's this Excel sheet. It's kind of dry to look at. But at times they give you very valuable information, right? In terms of how many students they're going to take for certain departments. And you just got to look at it, and there might be deviation, right? If an acceptance rate for a school is, say, 30%, there might be certain programs that are 40%, while others might be at 15%, right? So depending on what you're going in as, you can treat, you don't kind of categorize a school as a target reach safety. You categorize the program in that school as a target reach or safety.
So a specific major or specific type of
or a department, right? The department's really big because
what are some notable discrepancies that you can think of off the bat?
I don't know. Let's take Indiana, right? Indiana, it's a public school. Very reasonable acceptance rate. Relatively easier school to get into,
Sure.
right? Say compared to a lot of the upper end private schools. But if you try to get into the Kelley School of Business, right, then the story changes, right? You're looking at, I think the last time I checked was like 10 to 15%, right? Your chances are a little lower.
Just as competitive as some of the other,
right?
Ivy Leagues even.
The other one I'm thinking about is right on top of my head is Carnegie Mellon, right? Again, I think they have an acceptance rate close to like 15 to 20%, but computer science 2%, 1%. Story changes, right? So something that I think students need to think about, right? Do you want to major a particular thing, or do you want to go to the school, right?
That's interesting.
Right. And if you're willing to kind of change the major, right, because you want to go to a school, you might want to do that, right, in certain situations.
The numbers game.
Yeah. If you like Pittsburgh, if you like Carnegie Mellon, but you also like computer science, maybe it's better for that student to actually maybe, change their major, adjust their major, go to arts and science, find something in arts and science that might allow you to actually transfer into that program later on, right? I don't know, be a math major, right, at Carnegie. And if you're willing to do that for a couple of years and, try to get into the computer science program, right, like an internal transfer, then that's great, right?
So the numbers game is kind of twofold. One, it's looking at the school you want to be applying to and comparing your numbers to their general stats.
Mm-hmm.
But then two, considering the specific program that you're maybe interested in going to, seeing how your numbers stack up against those scores, and then maybe considering either changing your list in terms of changing the schools if you're really bent on doing that major, or if you're more leaning towards being at that institution, changing your major or maybe school considerations within the big university that are kind of more where your numbers are at.
Yeah, but I think a lot with what I see from a lot of undergraduate or at least high school students is that students are more attracted to schools than they are majors. There is the rare occasion that you have a student who's made up their mind on what they want to do. But I think one thing I always want to point to is that there's always graduate school, right? And if you pick a good enough major, right, it doesn't have to be the best major in the world. There's always that opportunity to do an extra 2 years, get a master's degree in something that you want to do. You don't have to go to NYU Stern as an undergrad, right? You can do, if you want to go to New York, I don't know, start with math, start with something easier. And then later on, just go transfer in, take your GMAT and just go into NYU Stern as a graduate student if necessary. Right? But don't feel the need to do everything in undergrad all the time, right?
We've talked about the factors now of kind of acceptances numbers. I think another number that comes up a lot is tuition. It's cost. It's financial aid. And I think another one also is career opportunities. I think post-grad opportunities is also something a lot of students maybe don't consider but should. What does that come into for you?
It's a discussion that I have with a lot of students. The first question I always ask students, I suppose, is because we work with we have a lot of American students, but we also have a lot of international students. And I ask them, where do you want to work, right? Do you want to work in the States? Do you want to work in Asia, right? Because I think the expectations are different, right? June, and Deanna and Joon, that in Asia, right, there is a certain set list of schools that are acceptable for
There's a
employment.
prestige value that is almost
Right.
entirely indicative of how
Right.
recruiters are going to see you.
Sure, there's a pretty well delineated list of named schools that you probably want to be in if you want to get a job here, coming from a U.S.
It's funny how
institution.
Dartmouth does not have pull
Dartmouth-
here.
no.
Despite it being one of the best schools in the world, it does not have pull in South Korea.
Yeah, it's funny. I had a student today who told me that who didn't know Dartmouth but thought Stanford was an Ivy League school, right? It's a very common misconception in this part of the world. But I think in the States, and you guys might know this a little bit, you might be able to explain this a lot better than me. I think in the States, yeah, sure, it helps, right? Coming out of a prestigious university. But it's also your just kind of willingness to learn and on the job, right? I don't think people are going to be as picky about where you come from as long as, during your internships or at least during your first couple of months at a job, you're showing a willingness to learn, right, as you go.
I think the school name might get you into the door or might put a little bit of distinction, but it's more about experience as well, I think.
I think there's definitely a shift right now we're kind of going on a slight tangent, but this is an interesting tangent. There is a slight shift in the trend of looking for job opportunities in the States, where it's more about like how well you did in college versus the name value of the institution you went to, but also I think there's a shift towards looking for students who kind of are going out of their way to experiment or gain experience in a certain field. Like, were you proactive in looking at, maybe you tried to take graduate level courses in a thing, you really did a lot of internships, you looked for research opportunities, you did kind of like an independent project.
That's a big thing I'll talk about.
Yeah.
Some schools open doors to internship opportunities.
Right.
That will eventually get you job opportunities.
Right.
I have a lot of students who finished they finished undergrad, right, from a really good school, and they're applying to graduate school, and one of the biggest, like, I suppose, concerning things I see is that they have nothing to talk about in their essay, right? I just a couple years ago, I think it was a student who wanted to get into dentistry and had never been stepped foot in a hospital or clinic before, right? So the only thing she can ever write about in her essay was what she learned in her undergrad. And I'm wondering, right, a student from a smaller school, maybe a less known school, right, who maybe has more experiences, right, who's tried out more things, probably has a leg up, right, in applying to those graduate schools later on. So it's kind of going with what Deanna and June, what you guys just said.
And
is
some
that it's
schools might
experiences.
also have med school or law school advantages. I think it's worth
Right.
if you're going for a very specific path.
Yeah.
Some schools have great programs that will kind of jumpstart you in there, or are known to produce doctors, are known to produce dentists.
Right. But just because we're talking about a college list right now, and I think if you haven't watched the NYU versus Brown video that we've put up, that was our last full length video to go up that June and I discussed, is June and I have very different college experiences. We both did a lot of extracurriculars, but we did very widely different extracurriculars. And I think one of the things that kind of Calvin is touching on is you got to go to a school where you're the right personality fit to look out for opportunities in the way your school is offering it to you. Like June did a lot of things that were very on campus, focused with the institutions community. You have a personality that does really well in looking out for opportunities, kind of making accomplishments in that setting. I am the very opposite. I went to a school that the school itself offers a lot of opportunities, but we can really proactively search for things that are outside of the institution that are maybe a better fit for us personally. So I think what Calvin is really getting to is go to a school that's going to allow you to search for the opportunities and experiences you need in the way that works for you. All of the different schools are going to do that in a very different way. But you got to have you got to do a little bit of introspection and figure out like what you can do and what you're good at doing, and maybe factor that in to your college considerations. Like, do you need to go to a smaller school that's going to give you a lot of clinic experience? Do you need to go to a school that has a lot of research experience? This is something that we talk about every time we have someone on to interview about their schools. Do you need to go where there's like a lot of one-on-one mentorship? Do you need to go to a school where you can kind of fly solo and do your own thing and do your own projects in your downtime? What is it that you need? Where can you go that you can really dive into that?
And so going back to the initial discussion is I think as a student you want to enjoy your time in university, right? It's not about getting that diploma at the end. It's the 4 years, right? 4 or 5 years that you're at a university. You need to make the most out of it, right? Whether that's, experiences in school, whether that's even making connections at the school, right? Those people you build relationships with in school, they might come into play later on, right? In terms of employment and opportunities and whatnot, right? Like 2, 3 years down the line.